Talk today about the home sale contingency as well as the bump clause. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So I'm talking specifically today about the closing a buyer's property contingency and the bump clause in the WB11 residential offer to purchase. Many of you know the offer was updated a couple months ago. This is one of the pieces that did change within the offer. So if you're looking at a condo offer to purchase, it's going to look a little bit different. Whereas in the condo offer to purchase, these two pieces are all one together. So the bump clause is just automatically a part of the closing a buyer's property contingency. When they updated the new offer, they did separate the two, so you could easily include both together or just one. So we'll talk a little bit about strategies and when you might include the bump clause, when you might not include the bump clause, how the buyer could remove the bump clause after acceptance, and of course, stop me at any time with questions. So a buyer is obviously going to need to include this contingency if they have a home to sell. If the only way they can purchase this new property is if they sell their old property. So it states that this offer is contingent upon the closing of the sale of the buyer's property located at blank. So they're going to put their old or their current home address, whatever property that is, no later than blank. So the deadline is typically going to be the closing date. So the closing date of the new property. Sometimes you know, or you have a better idea of what that closing date is if the buyer already has an accepted offer on their property that they're selling. If they don't have an accepted offer on the property that they're selling, the buyer just kind of has to make a guess as to roughly, or with the agent's help, when they expect their property to sell, how long, 30, 60 days. I would say if your buyer does not know or does not have an accepted offer currently on their property, putting a longer date on line 332, maybe like 60 days, because it is always easier to move a closing date up than it is to push it out later. So in most situations, that's the case. But the idea is that if the buyer doesn't sell the property by this date, they obviously can't close on this transaction. So this date either needs to be amended, which is the ideal scenario, or it goes on to state, if the closing does not occur by the deadline, this offer shall become null and void unless buyer delivers to seller on or before this deadline reasonable written verification from a financial institution or third party in control of buyer's funds that buyer has at the time of verification sufficient funds to close, or proof of bridge loan financing, along with a written notice waiving this contingency. So this deadline, let's just say it's May 29th, that I'm hoping to close on my old property so that I can purchase this new property. If May 29th comes and either I don't have an offer or I know that my old property is not going to close, again, I either need to amend this date to move it out later, or I need to deliver to the seller a waiver of this contingency along with proof of funds or proof of bridge loan financing that states, okay, I can purchase this property without closing on my other property. Otherwise, this offer becomes null and void. So it's a way to protect the seller and the buyer, of course, that, if the offer again can't close out, if they can't close on their property, their old property, then they won't be able to move forward with the new property, but they're not in any kind of default. So they would more than likely get their earnest money back if that were to be the case. Any questions on that top part of the offer?
So you just have to really keep an eye on that deadline so that you can do all that other stuff before. If it's May 29th, you should be sending them something, by the 27th 28,
Yeah.
not
I mean,
wait till that day.
if you, again, it's always different. Like if the buyer has an accepted offer on their house, that makes this a lot easier. Because what you're going to try to do is just keep the deals kind of at the same, that you have the closing date the same, and ideally everything's on track for both properties, that this date, isn't impacted in any way. Otherwise, if the buyer doesn't have an accepted offer on their house, and again, this is just kind of like a guess of, okay, let's hope we can close by this date. Communication with both the buyers, with the buyer selling the buyer's house, and communication with the listing agent of the house that they're buying is so key between those three
Yeah.
parties.
Shell game.
It can get to be, I mean, I've heard of deals where like there's like 4 dominoes, all, that 4 different buyers have property closing a
Yeah.
buyer's property contingency. And if one falls, then they all can fall.
Yeah. Right.
So it can get messy. But a lot of buyers obviously need this contingency to protect themselves because they need the proceeds from their sale to move forward with the purchase.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, communication's key with this contingency. And going back to Beth, your comment, just that with this deadline, again, if the buyer does not have an accepted offer, as you move forward to whatever date you put in here, again, if the buyer doesn't have an accepted offer and you're like approaching 20 days to this deadline, you're probably going to need to start talking to the listing agent about, okay, we still don't have an accepted offer. Like we need to talk about amending this deadline because it's obvious the buyer's not going to close by this time. So
because maybe they are okay extending it out, maybe they can't. So then you know what your options are.
Exactly. Yep. It's always a risk with the buyer. I mean, buyers just have to understand that this is a risk of the home buying process, and there's not a guarantee that this is going to come together, especially if a buyer has to include a bump clause.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll move on to talking about the bump clause.
I will say, Kimmy, can I just,
Yeah,
before you move on to the bump?
yes.
The one thing that I will remind agents on closing of buyer's property, if you have that in your offer and buyer and seller agree to amend the closing date, you also have to remember to amend this date on line 332.
Yes.
So we had an issue in our office where an agent amended the closing, pushed it out another month, and this date did not change. And the agent was approaching this date and they still didn't have, they weren't going to close on that property a month earlier, obviously, because that closing date got pushed out. So, sometimes when you have agents that aren't in communication that way, that can be a little tricky. So just make sure when you're tracking your dates and deadlines, if you have this, this can be not easily forgotten, but it can be missed because it's not a deadline that you're really tracking in terms of all your regular dates and deadlines. It doesn't even look like, a calendar date or deadline in there. So.
Right. Great point.
Remind agents to track that one too.
Yes. Great point. Yeah. All right. Anything else before I move into the bump clause? Okay. So, like I was saying in the beginning, the bump clause is now separated from the closing a buyer's property contingency. The bump clause is, so the closing a buyer's property contingency is like one of the worst contingencies, is the simplest way to put it, for a buyer to put into an offer, as far as how appealing it is for the seller. There's just so much uncertainty with it, and it really protects the buyer that, you could get to the date before closing and the buyer could say, sorry, haven't sold my house, offer's null and void. And it puts seller in a really bad spot. So the bump clause was created to try to make it look a little more appealing to the seller. So, okay, I've got this really yucky contingency, but I'm also including a bump clause, which says that the seller may continue to market the property. So if you have a bump clause in the offer, as a listing agent, you do not need to change the status in MLS to active with contingencies or active with offer. You can keep it as simply active and continue to market it as if you're accepting, market it as if you didn't have an offer, essentially. However, seller or buyers would still need to write as a secondary offer. So if the seller accepts a secondary offer, the seller then can give notice to this primary buyer that they've accepted another offer. And then buyer has so many hours, 72 is the default. So let's say this is 72 hours, buyer would have 72 hours to determine whether or not they can waive this contingency. If they can waive this contingency plus anything else here, which we'll talk about in a minute, then they are able to stay in primary position. And then there's no more property, closing a buyer's property contingency. If they can't waive this contingency or deliver other documentation as stated, then the offer is null and void. And that secondary offer moves into primary position. So what are some of the things that the buyer might have to provide in order to stay in primary position? One is, which is automatically a part of this, is number one, they have to waive this contingency. So that's, if you as the buyer's agent don't do anything, which you don't have to include anything in the lines below here, that could be it. So the buyer could simply just say, okay, we are waiving our property contingency. You know, if a buyer has an offer on their house, they're through inspection, the buyer on their house has delivered financing commitment or loan commitment. Maybe they feel really confident that our transaction is going to close. We're not concerned about that anymore. We're going to waive the contingency, no problem, and we move forward. The seller could also, so if you're a buyer's agent, I would just leave it at that. I would not overcomplicate it for your buyer. And you know, if you leave it at this, again, all they have to provide is a notice stating that they're waiving this contingency. If you're a listing agent representing your seller, I would also want the buyer to include possibly a written waiver of maybe other contingencies, maybe the financing commitment contingency. Maybe also any contingency, if there's an inspection contingency still left, appraisal contingency, maybe there's, I mean, you could list in here any remaining contingencies. Plus, you could also check one of these boxes which says that the buyer must also provide proof of bridge loan and proof of ability to close from a financial, so a proof of funds, one of these options. And you could include some additional language here like, okay, in order to stay in primary, you must also pay additional earnest money. And I would be specific, so additional $1,000 of earnest money. So there's some different options from, well, one is from a buyer side to make your offer look more appealing, including some additional things below here will make it more appealing to the seller. But then again, as a listing agent, I would maybe want to counter the offer to include some additional documentation that the buyer needs to provide in order to stay in primary. Any questions on that so far? Does that all make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So when a seller gets a secondary offer, they are not obligated. They can accept a secondary offer, but they don't have to give the primary buyer notice. So maybe they've accepted a decent secondary offer, but their primary offer is better term-wise, besides the fact that they have this bump or the closing a buyer's property contingency. And so they don't want to bump the primary buyer yet, but they want to, you know, just have that secondary offer just in case. That is totally permissible. It's up to the seller. What else?
So when in this situation, they do that accepted offer and it does have that bump clause so they can continue to market it. On MLS, does the listing agent put that the contingency, like an accepted offer contingency, or no?
They don't. Nope. They don't
Okay.
mark it as
Okay.
contingent. Nope.
So that's why as an agent, you might call on a property and be like, are there any offers on the property? If you don't see that, you just maybe want to double check.
Totally. Yeah. Most people, and I will say probably the professional thing to do would be to put in private remarks that this offer does have a accepted offer with a bump clause. I mean, because the agent's they're gonna need to know whether they need to write it as a secondary offer, obviously. So, and I mean, I've heard of agents getting upset when they're not made aware of that up front. Maybe, I mean, I don't know why, but I think it's just professional to make agents aware of that before they even schedule a showing.
It's
But-
definitely in the listing agent's, you know, interest to make sure parties know, because usually when you're writing a secondary offer, you're kind of trying to sweeten the deal a little bit. So
Oh, true.
it is
Right.
it is in the listing interest or
And I
listing
think
agent's
now
interest.
with things going so fast, I know I was showing a house and then it was on showing time, and all of a sudden, like, we literally drove there and then all of a sudden it popped up that there was an offer on it. So we're standing in front of the house. And so I called, she said, oh yes, but we're accepting secondaries. So go
Yeah.
ahead and look.
Yeah.
Like, they don't even have time to change it.
Yeah.
How long can you hold on to that secondary offer without telling the buyer?
So you can hold on to it as long as you want, really. You never have to notify the primary buyer. So let me jump to, that's actually a good segue into, I was going to pull up the language. Oh, it's right below here. The language for a secondary offer. So if you are a buyer writing as a secondary, you have to determine how many days you're willing to stay in secondary before you can withdraw your offer. So typically this is like 3 days.
Yeah, 7 is long.
7 is long. Yeah.
That
I will
means you
say-
can't put in an offer during that time, because what if that other offer gets accepted?
Exactly.
You-
So buyer,
Ugh.
7 is too long.
yeah. If you're
Especially now.
right, if you're writing an offer for a buyer in secondary position, they need to be prepared that during this time period, they can't or shouldn't, can't is probably not the right word, because could they? Yeah, but is it smart? No, because they could, like you said, they could end up with 2 accepted offers. They should not write on any other properties. As a listing agent, though, you're going to want to make sure that this deadline is at least as long as this deadline, because what you would not want to happen is, let's say this is 2 days and your buyer, the primary buyer, has 72 hours or 3 days to determine if they're going to waive this contingency and stay in primary or not. If all of a sudden, you've given primary buyer notice, and then day 2 or day 3 here, the secondary buyer all of a sudden is like, never mind, I'm withdrawing my offer, you could potentially lose both offers. So as a listing agent, you got to be sure that this deadline, your secondary offer, stays in secondary position longer than the time that your primary buyer has to make their decision.
You got to keep one on the hook.
Exactly. Yeah. So I would say like 3 to 4 is typical for the secondary offer, because sometimes this is 48 to 72 hours is typical. And then again, so if the secondary offer hasn't been notified that they've become primary within this time frame, it's up to them. They can still stay in secondary. They don't have to withdraw once the 4 days comes and goes. They can stay in secondary position as long as they want. So if, day 5 comes and they still haven't received notice that they've been made primary, and they're saying to the seller, hey, what's going on? Why? And the seller's saying, well, we haven't given the primary buyer notice yet. And I've heard this happening where then these buyers get mad, but it's their choice. They can, again, stay in secondary, or they can withdraw and move on to another property.
So Kimmy, I've never heard of this happening, but could a buyer theoretically counter in or include, when they're writing a secondary offer, that the seller will notify the primary within X. I mean, I'm assuming you could draft language to include
Forces.
that.
I suppose you could.
I'm just trying to think, because I know I've had this happen where, you know, a buyer writes a secondary offer thinking that they're going to notify.
I don't think
notify the primary, and it doesn't
Yeah.
happen for a while.
I don't
But-
think you can dictate the terms of another offer, but I guess theoretically, if you
I'm
wrote
just
that in an offer and the seller accepted it, then they're agreeing to.
Yeah,
So
I
that's a
just
good
am thinking,
question.
if you're in the buyer situation writing a secondary, if you could
Yeah.
say seller shall provide notice to primary buyer within 72 hours or something.
Yeah.
You know, I don't, anyway.
That's a good question. I don't know the straight answer to that one, but
Things that we can come up with.
yeah. The other
Well, then
thing
after that 4 days, you know, and then that buyer, the secondary person, they do have to withdraw it if they don't want to stay there anymore. They want to be free to go make an offer somewhere else.
Yep,
Right.
they have to formally withdraw. So the
Okay.
buyers would draft a notice stating that our offer is hereby withdrawn.
Okay.
Otherwise, if they don't do that, then at any time the sellers could give them notice stating, hey, your offer's primary. And then all dates and deadlines start from the time that notice is given. The other thing to consider with secondary offers is, so here's where it states, unless otherwise provided, seller is not obligated to give buyer notice prior to any deadline, nor is any particular secondary buyer given the right to be made primary ahead of other secondary buyers. So if this is a super competitive property, you might want to consider kind of amending this language a little bit, because basically if seller has an accepted primary, and then let's say they get 3 different secondary offers, doesn't matter which one came first. They could get an offer on, you know, one day and then the next day get another secondary offer. The seller could choose any of those secondary offers to be made primary. So what I've seen some agents do is strike this, nor is any particular secondary buyer given the right to be made primary ahead of other secondary buyers. And then in additional provisions, make a statement of this secondary offer shall supersede any other secondary offer. Meaning that, you know, if a buyer or seller gets multiple secondary offers, my offer is the one that has to be considered first. Now, if I'm a listing agent, I would probably counter that out because it's not in the best interest of your seller. All right, the other thing that I want to jump into is, so obviously the fact that the bump clause has been separated from the closing a buyer's property contingency, again, you could just have this contingency and not include a bump clause. And I'd done this a few times on offers when the bump clause was a part of the closing a buyer's property contingency, and I would just strike out the bump clause language. But now it makes it really easy that you just simply don't check this box. Sellers are more willing to accept a closing a buyer's property contingency without the bump clause if the buyer's property is under contract and you're through inspection. Those are kind of the 2 key things I think are important for a seller to be willing to accept a closing a buyer's property contingency without a bump clause.
How do you let them know that that's the case, where the status is?
So I would typically just write in additional provisions that buyer has a accepted offer on, you can either write in additional provisions that buyer has an accepted offer on this property, or just in your cover letter to the listing agent when you're delivering the offer that, hey, there's a closing a buyer's property contingency. This property already has an offer. It's set to close this date. We're through inspection. We're through whatever. It is permissible for you to send a copy of that accepted offer to the listing agent. That's the only time it's permissible for agents to deliver contracts to each other. And I forget where it is in the offer. Right here, lines 461 to 467. At the bottom, it says distribute copies of this offer to the seller or seller's agent of another property which seller intends on purchasing. So obviously it wouldn't be this offer. It would be the offer that the seller or the buyer receives on the property they're selling. So that's a way you can provide that proof that, hey, we've got an accepted offer.
That's almost a proof of funds, sort of.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah. And then obviously too, as the listing agent, you're checking to see, okay, is this an MLS? Is it, when you're checking all the history in MLS of when was it under contract, all those things to just, again, verify for your seller that it is in fact under contract and, well into the contract period.
Okay, Kimmy, I have a client right now, and there was no bump clause on the offer to purchase. So, but he wanted to have secondary offers coming in. Is there any way he could do that?
Yeah. So seller can accept a secondary offer at any time for whatever reason, even if there's no bump clause. The secondary offers just have to wait until that primary offer, if the primary offer falls apart, which there's obviously an unknown time period of how long, if and how long that would be. So, I mean, if I actually personally had this happen, I was working with buyers. They found a property that they absolutely loved. It was under contract, no bump clause. My buyer said, you know what, we want to write a secondary offer. We really love this house. The listing agent was kind of giving me some hints that he wasn't feeling really confident with the primary offer for whatever reason. Wasn't telling me what exactly because he couldn't, but just, sellers really strongly encouraging secondary offers. So we wrote a secondary offer. Seller accepted it. We waited. We actually amended this date like 2 times because I think initially we wrote 4 days and then that came and went, and the seller still couldn't put us into primary, but wanted us to stick around. So we kept amending this date. Ultimately, what ended up happening is the buyers of the primary offer missed their earnest money delivery deadline. They delivered it like 3 days late. So the seller, liking the secondary offer terms better, was attempting to terminate that first offer before they could make our offer primary. And ultimately it all worked out. But long story short, yeah, the seller can accept a secondary offer at any time, no matter what the terms of the first offer are.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So another scenario, let's say you have a buyer who has to have this contingency, and their property is not on the market yet, or they don't, either not on the market or they just don't have an accepted offer. There is some additional language that you can include. So again, if their house does not have an accepted offer, bump clause is going to be more appealing to the seller. So you've got a home sale contingency with a bump clause. And then in additional provisions, we have this clause in our clause library. Under the offer to purchase category, it's called the removal of bump clause. I'm going to insert that. I didn't have enough room. Okay.
Just because they shortened all those additional provision lines.
I know. So you may need to put this in addendum A or attach.
Now.
I hate that they did that.
Yeah.
I'll read it from here. So it basically says, okay, my offer initially has a bump clause, but once I deliver to you notice that I have accepted an offer on my home, the bump clause is withdrawn, or it's removed. There's no more bump clause. That's what this whole paragraph is stating.
Well, then you don't have to do anything else if that happens. Like put in another amendment or anything.
Right. So the way this would work is if we included this. So again, there's a bump clause initially, but once I receive an accepted offer on my property, all I have to do is the buyer's agent is deliver notice to the seller stating,
Okay.
buyer hereby has an accepted offer on blah, blah, blah property. And again, the buyer's agent can deliver a copy of that accepted offer to the listing agent as verification. Then it goes on to say that the seller's rights to declare the offer null and void pursuant to the closing of buyer's property contingency shall be canceled. So again, that's basically stating that the bump clause is removed. The seller can no longer issue me a bump notice and declare this offer null and void. Then it goes on to say, for further protection for the buyer, if the buyer's property still, for whatever reason, fails to close, the buyer may, at buyer's option, declare this offer null and void by giving seller written notice, and earnest money shall be returned to the buyer. So it's just one other kind of strategy if the buyer is not comfortable with having the bump clause in place the whole time, but just until, hey, I've got the proof that we have an accepted offer, it protects them. But again, on the flip side, if you're the listing agent, I would be cautious about a contingency or a clause like this, because it doesn't really protect the seller as much. So always good to consider it from both sides. But yeah, you wouldn't be able to put that in additional provisions in the offer to purchase. You'd have to attach it to addendum A, or you can attach a blank addendum if you need some additional, even more space. All right. I feel like I've covered everything that I wanted to cover with regards to this. Does anybody have any other questions or any other input?
I have one more tiny piece of input.
Please, Catherine.
Of course. The other point where you were talking about, Kimmy, that you're working with a buyer and they are, they don't have their house on the market yet, or they don't have their house on the market. Basically, that would be the scenario. If you're on the listing side and you receive an offer from a buyer like this, I've often seen counter offers, or even if you're writing it into the offer to make it a little more clear to the seller and a little more enticing, that you will have the property in MLS within 5 business days or something like that.
Yep.
I just dealt with one like that earlier this year. We didn't have a property on the market yet because the buyers didn't want to sell their lovely house until they made sure they had another one to go to.
Right.
So I've seen that written a lot where, a listing agent will counter it in just saying buyers agree to have property in MLS within 5 business days.
Yep.
And I would also say, have that conversation again with the co-broke on, the listing agent I was working with was very candid with me about what I was going to be listing the property at, to make sure it's like, okay, the market value is, $220 and you're not listing that property for $300,000 or something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing that I've seen kind of in this section.
Yeah. That actually just struck my memory of something else I've seen, which was really unique. And I've only seen this like 3 times maybe. Buyer, and this was on a property that was sitting for a while. So buyer kind of had the upper hand in this situation. This is actually on one of my listings. The agent wrote the offer with the closing of buyer's property contingency without a bump clause. So no bump clause. However, it stated like what Catherine was saying, that the buyers agreed to put their property in MLS as, active within 48 hours of acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Then it also stated that if the buyers didn't deliver notice that they had an accepted offer on their house within 30 days, then the bump clause is hereby inserted into the offer.
Yes.
So it's a way to kind of, protect the buyers at least up front. Like, we're hopeful that we can get an offer right away, or we're feeling confident we can get an offer right away. So we don't want there to be a bump clause. But if we're like, oh, we have been on the market now for 30 days, we still have no offer. Okay, seller, now you can change the offer, change the status in MLS back to active to show that you're, actively marketing the property, and you could bump us if you get a secondary offer.
Yeah,
So
that's
I thought that was interesting, and it worked out well for both parties. I mean, I think it's a good kind of give and take in a way.
Yeah, I have heard of that on a very limited basis, but 30 days is a pretty generous amount of time.
Yeah.
I was thinking you'd say, like 14 days or.
I will say these sellers were desperate for
Okay, yeah.
an offer. Yeah.
But yeah, this area can get a little bit complicated. And
It can. Yeah. And you can
fortunately,
kind of-
we're not dealing with it too often because a lot of times it's just not even a possibility. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, anybody else have anything to discuss with regards to this or anything else? Well, fabulous. Thank you for joining me today on today's contract training. And as always, these will be put on our YouTube page, so you can rewatch them if you need to reference this again.
What are you doing next week? You're going through.
Next week is a great question. I believe it's back to compliance and command. So no contract training next week. Next week is just a review of zip form, executing documents, getting it linked to your command. And then in May, first week of May, I think I'm going over the residential offer to purchase. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe that's what I'm going to do.
Cool.
So awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good to see your faces.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.